So in this particular lesson, we are going to cover another important topic like SAML. Very similar to SAML, in fact, OIDC and OAuth. This is the protocol we use for Google authentication. For example, when you use Google to authenticate into a different application, say for example, ChatGPT or DeepSeek or Cloud or anything for that matter, when you use Google, Facebook, Instagram, everywhere we use this particular technique. Very similar to SAML itself with subtle differences, both OAuth and OIDC. In fact, it is very similar in terms of flow, couple of subtle differences. Let's have a quick look into the topic. So open ID Connect or OIDC in short, along with OAuth or OAuth 2.0. These are very similar protocols, authentication plus authorization mechanism. And theoretically, from an academic standpoint, both of these protocols are very similar to SAML as well, based on verification and tokens and numbers, everything we have discussed so far. Slightly different orders and slightly different requirements. Most of the differences are not very relevant to the context of this particular training. A lot of jargons they use in the context of all these different protocols, but all of them are just old wine in new bottles. And most of these differences are due to certain attacks possible. To mitigate that possibility of certain attacks, they always refine the flow of these kind of protocols. Now, as I said, this is very similar to SAML. If you have followed the SAML lesson, you will not have any difficulty with this, although there's a little more complicated code and a little more involvement of the server-side coding involved here. First, let's go through some jargons, and before that, let's see where we use this in common world. In our daily life, do we use these things, or these are just technical jargons out there? Absolutely no. I'm pretty sure at least once in a day, if you're using any application these days, or any authentication, Gmail, Facebook, Instagram, any social media, it's all pretty much this protocol for authentication. So simple scenario is, today I was using, for example, DeepSeek R1. I was just using and testing this particular chatbot, newly come up at the time of this presentation. So what I did, I gone to chat in my browser. It redirected me to a page which says, you have not logged in, you have to log in. It gave me a couple of options. It gave the email and password option, thereon login, the email and password. Along with that, it showed me a Google authentication as well. I selected the Google authentication. Once I selected that, I got redirected to the Google page, the Google authentication page. And in that page, Google, so this is the accounts.google.com page, it asked me, I'm going to share this much things with DeepSeek. Do you want to allow? So DeepSeek was there in the Google page. And I said, okay. So there was an okay button here. I clicked okay or agree, whatever it was. So I clicked on that, and then the DeepSeek got my email ID and it logged me in, and I was able to chat and use DeepSeek R1. Very simple, couple of clicks, it happened. This is a workflow which we always use in our daily life, using Google authentication or Facebook authentication or Instagram or something else to authenticate to a website. Here, this is the identity provider or STS, secure token service. All these jargons, don't scare with all these jargons. STS, secure token service, identity provider. It's all same thing in different names. We have learned all these things. So be confident about all these jargons. Trust me, it is the jargons which you're gonna face from now onwards, because you know all the basics of cryptography and everything. It is the different jargons which is going to trip you down. But This workflow which I have explained, which I use today to log into deepseek.com, is something we see in our daily life. And this is nothing but OAuth. This authentication which we are going to see in this particular lesson is OAuth. In fact, in our example, we are going to see a little more complicated example. We'll see that shortly after discussing the jargons and terminologies we'll be using. But essentially, when we use something like Google authentication to log into something like chat.deepseek.com or anything like that, we are using essentially OAuth. OAuth and OpenID Connect, they are just one and the same thing. It's a slight difference. In fact, I would say OAuth is like a superset of OpenID Connect. In the end, you get a login token or the authentication token, while you get a slightly different types of token here where you give that to some other service to get some resource accessed. But otherwise, it's just the same thing in different name. So being said that, let's get into some of the jargons we'll be using, some of the terminologies. And especially these terminologies can be different in other publications. In fact, the terminologies for certain things are different between this documentation and the OAuth documentation. So it doesn't matter, we'll be using some terminologies which I'm going to explain next. So the first term I would like to introduce is the term called a user. In most cases, user can be a human being or asset owner, or resource owner. Basically, an entity. There are certain scenarios in which this is not a human being. It can be a service. It can be a code running somewhere. But let's assume that it's a user. It's a human entity who has the username and password to access certain resource sitting somewhere and the corresponding authority as well to access it. So that is the definition of user. So he has a username and password or some kind of credentials which he can use. For example, in the case of Gmail, you are the user with the username and password. And along with that, you will have some kind of additional multi-factor authentication and things like that. Whatever you need to access Google account, you have it. So you are the user. Now there is this concept of client. So don't get confused with client and user. Client is slightly different. Client. In our case, in the example we are going to see, the client is a small web application, web app. But the client can be anything. It can be a mobile application. It can be anything pretty much the user will be interacting with. So the client must be delivering HTML pages to a browser, and the user must be entering certain username and password and things like that. So client is, in our case, it's a web application, but it can be anything like a mobile application or a single page web application. Lot many options are there. So we'll see client code, so you'll understand more about it. But client is another entity we are going to deal with. Another entity we'll be seeing is the web browser itself, web browser. Edge, Chrome, all these different things are there. So in our case, the client will be delivering HTML pages to this web browser. And the HTTP redirect, which is one of the very important operation, is done basically by the browser. The browser is redirecting the page, the HTTP redirect. If you have any questions on this kind of things, feel free to watch the networking training because we are discussing HTTP there. But ultimately, the redirection is happening inside a web browser. So in our case, the client is a server-side application. So it's a server-side application, although the terminology is a little confusing. It's actually a small web server with a page, with a couple of pages. Now in the web browser, user will see different UIs like you're going to see, and the basic authentication, authorization, all the username and password and other OTPs and things are entered into the web browser in our case. The next important entity is the identity provider itself, where we are going to keep the username and password, the IDP. It is also called STS or Secure Token Service. The ultimate goal of this particular entity is to verify some inputs coming from client, user, and web browser at different places, we'll see shortly, and output a token. That is what it is called, secure token service. Basically converting the permission and the credentials of this user into a secure token. That is the purpose of STS. So that token is also called JWT, JSON Web Token. We'll see that. And finally, we have one more thing in our demo, is the service itself, the service. So basically, all the hard work we are doing is to access this particular service, securely access this particular service. So in our scenario, we have a web application here, which is trying to access this particular service right here. We need to access this particular resource. This can be anything. In our case, it's a cloud account in the example we are going to see. But at the end of the day, it can be a chatbot, it can be DeepSeek, it can be anything useful. It can be something you can purchase, order something, book a hotel, anything, any service here. Now, the challenge is that this particular web application right here doesn't have any kind of authentication at all. It doesn't handle any authentication. Now, it is going to depend on this thing right here. For example, Gmail or Facebook, the STS provider, the IDP, to make sure that this user has the right username and password. So this client web application, it's a very lightweight code. You will see it's just hardly 100 lines of code, and it needs secure access to this particular service right here. And it wants to give all the heavy lifting to this particular service right here from the authentication perspective, making sure that the user is who he is claiming to be. His password has not been compromised. For example, this particular user has been using this particular username and password from, say, for example, Sydney. All of a sudden, he's accessing it from Amsterdam. All of a sudden, it is the responsibility of this guy to make sure that his password is not compromised. It figures that out and asks for additional authentication. So all that complicated logic is built into STS. And this guy is not even bothered about verifying all these things. He will delegate that to this particular service. This is exactly what happens in the case of SAML. We have seen that. As I said, this is pretty much similar to SAML. Now, it is not wrong to say that OIDC OAuth 2.0 is like a superset of SAML, but I do see SAML has its own usage even today as we speak, especially in a corporate scenario. Now, the subtle difference between SAML and OIDC is pretty much kind of this particular part right here. So SAML is mostly done in a web scenario. The service, mostly the service and the client is kind of merged in the case of SAML. But in the case of OIDC, you will see shortly OIDC or OAuth. Let me use the term OAuth because OIDC is like a logon only protocol. OAuth is more general. In the case of OAuth, mainly the focus is REST APIs rather than a web application itself. So you are accessing a REST API. Normally this thing is a REST API. This service is a REST API. In the case of SAML, normally this is a page, a web page getting rendered on a browser. But because of this is a REST API, this can be accessed from a mobile application, can be accessed from a non-web scenario, from a Windows native application. You can use that. So that way, OpenID Connect and all these like a superset of SAML. Now, if you ask me, SAML can be tweaked to use with the REST API, 100% yes. But the frameworks are there yet? Probably not, because there is already things which does that. So a lot of people tell me that SAML is overridden by OIDC OAuth. Probably not a very correct statement. I still believe SAML has its own place and one of the most used protocol even today in a corporate secure environment. In fact, due to the public nature of client and web browser and user, all these three entities are very sneaky entities at the end of the day in a public domain. There are more attacks on OIDC and OAuth than SAML. SAML is not used in a public scenario normally. So being said that, let's see how this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things works together. So we have discussed the user, the client, the web browser, the identity provider, and then finally the service. So in the next diagram, I'm going to stick with the example we are going to see. I'll be a little more concrete about these entities because we can discuss the code after that and it'll make sense. Because it's not exactly the workflow, not exactly similar workflow. It's a little more complicated than the workflow we have seen with the DeepSeek when I discussed in the beginning. So that is one point to note here. To explain the flow, we have the user here. So this is the user. And we have the browser here, let's say Edge. And we have the client, which is where the browser is getting the web pages from. So this is a small web server which delivers web pages in our case, a small web application. And then we have the IDP. In this case, it is the Azure. And then the service which we want to access, it is also an Azure account, as a matter of fact. Basically, this particular user has the permission. So he's the owner of this particular Azure account. He has all the required permissions and authority to access. His credential has access to this particular account. Now what we are trying to do is to share that access with this particular client. That is the workflow we are trying to achieve here. So that is exactly what you're doing when you access, say for example, when you try to access ChatGPT using Google account, you are sharing the data inside your Google account with someone else, which is ChatGPT in this case. Same thing you're doing here. You're trying to share your access. You are the user. The user is here. This user is trying to share his access to this particular account with this particular application because it is trusting this particular client right here. So this particular client is known to the IDP. So this particular IDP, this particular client is known. This IDP has set up in a slightly different account. This client application is present or registered inside a different Azure account in this particular case. Now we are going to run the client application. It's a Python web application. And when you access that particular application, it will show a particular page to the browser. So a page will be shown here to the browser. Inside that page, what will be displayed is nothing but which Azure account you need to access. Similar to an option, which ID you want to use. For example, when you try to access, say, ChatGPT using Google, you will have multiple account selected. Like that, you will be asked to enter something called tenant ID, which is nothing but which Azure account you want to access. Basically, we need to give the account ID of this particular resource. So the client will enter the account information of the particular Azure account to which he has permission on. So the user will enter that here inside the browser. Now again, with the tenant ID, we'll go back to the client. Then the client will try to create something called an application. So how does it create an application? So what it does is it gives some of the secrets it's having with the IDP along with the tenant ID. Now this is all in-memory data structures, the client app within the client memory, the client app. So once we create the client app using the tenant ID and the client secrets, this is the tenant ID which is coming from the user, and you can think of this as a client ID and client secret. So IDP verifies this and give the client a redirection URL. So this is the redirection URL. So this redirection URL is given back to the browser to redirect. And this redirection will directly go into the IDP right here. And this will show all the required things on the browser to authenticate the username and password. And then it'll ask, hey, this particular client is trying to access XYZ thing in your account. Do you want to allow? All that kind of information happens here. We will see that shortly. Username and password, if it is not authenticated. And along with that, you will get a prompt whether this particular client, so this particular client name will come up, is trying to access XYZ thing in this particular account. It is trying to read all the virtual machines or anything it would like to do, this particular client would like to do. And the user is gonna allow it. And the information goes back to the IDP because this particular page is shown by the IDP and the information goes back to the IDP and the IDP approves that request. It verifies all the information given by the user and it approves. Now, one of the things which will happen after the approval is another redirection. So IDP will ask the browser or the user to redirect to the client. So that is a different URL and that redirection will happen to the client. In that redirection, we will have something called auth code. So client has the auth code. Using the auth code, client can connect to this particular IDP and get a JWT token or access token. And using the access token, the client can access this resource right here. The flow looks a little complicated compared to SAML because of the presence of the client here. One of the important things we need to understand here is that the client is a non-entity to the IDP. One of the main difference between SAML and OIDC auth. The client is a non-entity. How do we know that? Because client has its own secret and ID. So the first main step is this particular piece right here, which I'm drawing in red. The client is connecting to the IDP and getting the redirection URL for the browser. What are the inputs client is giving? The inputs client is giving is the tenant ID, which we got from the user, and its own ID, the client ID, which means that the client is already known to the IDP. So we'll see how to create a client inside the IDP. Inside Azure, we'll see how to create one of these client application. After creating that, what we're gonna get is a client ID and a client secret. Now, when we give the client ID and client secret along with the tenant ID to the IDP, what we are getting is a redirection URL. This redirection URL is a URL of the IDP. What that URL does? That URL will take all the necessary username and password. So the client is getting that redirection URL, client is going, and the redirection URL is getting rendered. So this is an HTTP request right here with the redirection URL, and the redirection URL is getting delivered, and all the username and password and all kind of different things are coming from the IDP, all the requests, all the authentication and authorization. One of the important things will happen here is the permission to grant. It will ask, the IDP will ask the user to grant permission for this particular client application. So there is a name for that application. Whether you want to allow this particular guy to access things in your account. This guy is the owner of this account. So it will ask whether you need to give permission for this particular guy right here. So that happens here. And if everything goes well, the IDP will ask the browser to redirect to a particular place inside the client. Very important part. With an auth code. Where is this auth code is coming? auth code is coming from the IDP. Basically, the result of this operation as well as the permission given by the client is an auth code or authentication code. Using that code, so we'll get that code, we can get an access token. This is an access token, which is a JWT token. And using that JWT token, the client can access. So client got the same permission or whatever permission the user has permitted right here to access this particular account right here. So the flow looks a little complicated, but it'll make a little more sense when we see the practical and when we see the code. You will feel much more comfortable. As I always say, this particular lesson and the next one which you're going to watch, you need to get it done more than once so that the complete flow will be in picture. This is a slightly complicated flow. I purposefully selected this flow, otherwise it will look exactly like SAML. If I analyze that DeepSeek flow, which we discussed in the beginning, it's exactly looking like SAML. There is no difference. But this case, it is slightly different because this client is going to call the APIs from Azure after all the authentication is said and done. So that's where the reason for this complication right here. You will feel much more comfortable once you see the code of this application, the client application code, and we'll see how the client is created inside the IDP and the whole thing working. So to conclude, we have seen a lot of theory around OIDC and OAuth in general. Now let's look at the practical, the demo of all the things we discussed. So we'll be looking into an application and securing that application using OAuth OIDC. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.